The chamber was the most beautiful room that had ever existed. That was not an opinion, it was a measurement. The Galactic Conclave's main hall had been built over 400 years by 47 different species working in shifts, each adding what their civilization considered sacred architecture. The result was something that should not have worked. Too many styles, too many materials, too many ideas about what beauty meant, but it did work in the way that impossible things sometimes do. The ceiling was 300 m high and made of something they called skyglass, which let in filtered light from the system's star in colors that shifted by the hour. Right now in the early session it was a deep amber. By midday it would turn blue. The floor was polished black stone that reflected everything above it like a still lake. 214 species sat in curved rows that circled the central speaking platform. Some sat in chairs, some stood in tanks of water, some clung to the walls with appendages that had no human name, some breathed filtered air through masks. Some needed nothing but the room itself. 40 billion screens across the galaxy were live. This was the moment. Everyone knew it was the moment. 200 years of Earth sending messages into the dark, then learning the dark was full, and listening, then the slow and painful work of being accepted, being laughed at, being tested, being doubted, and finally being called to the table. Amara Osei walked to the central platform. She was 63 years old. Her hair was silver white and cut close to her head. She wore a dark blue suit that she had bought in Accra 11 years ago and kept for exactly this occasion. Her shoes were sensible. She was not a woman who made decisions about shoes twice. She carried no notes. She had given 40,000 speeches in her life. She did not need notes. The chamber went quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience settling, the total quiet of 214 species deciding together in that same instant. That silence was the correct response to what they were watching. Amara Os looked out at the room. She smiled. It was not a political smile. It was not a diplomat's tool. It was the smile of a woman who had been told no so many times that yes had become the most extraordinary word in any language, and she was standing inside a yes the size of the galaxy. She opened her mouth. My name, she said, is Amara Osei. I am from a planet called Earth, and I am here because my people refused. She stopped. She listed to the left just slightly, like a building that has lost one support beam and hasn't decided yet whether to fall. Then she was on the ground. No one moved for 2 seconds. The kind of 2 seconds that last the rest of your life. Then everyone moved at once. Verith of the Kethara was sitting in the observer gallery, 40 m above the main floor. When it happened, he had a clear view. He was a careful observer by training and by nature. And in the first 2 seconds, in the 2 seconds when everyone else was processing and not yet responding, he watched the Vethkai delegate. The Vethkai delegate's name was Sovrath. He was tall, blue-gray skinned, and wore the formal robes of his empire's diplomatic corps. He had delivered the ceremonial greeting breath cloud when Osei arrived at the platform. Standard Vethkai protocol, considered an honor. In those 2 seconds, Sovrath's expression was not shocked, it was satisfied. Verith had spent 90 years studying species. He knew what satisfaction looked like. Across 300 different faces, bodies, and biological architectures, he picked up his recording device and noted the time. Then he noted what he had seen. Then he sat very still and thought about what it meant. He had read humanity's file. He had read every species file. It was his job. Humanity's file was interesting. Unusually aggressive history, unusually fast technological development, unusual capacity for what their own psychologists called group cohesion. Under threat, that last part had been flagged by several Kethara analysts as worth monitoring. Verith looked down at the chamber floor where Amara Osei lay, surrounded by medical teams doing things that would not help. He thought about worth monitoring. He thought it might be the most wrong phrase he had ever filed away. Dao Pham was 31 years old and had been Earth's attaché to the conclave for 3 years. His job was to stand behind the Secretary General and look professional, and hand her things when she needed them. He had nothing to hand her now. He stood 6 m from where she had fallen. His feet had moved him there without his permission. He could see her face. Her eyes were open and she was looking at the ceiling, at the amber light coming through the skyglass, and then she was not looking at anything. His communicator buzzed, then buzzed again. The feeds were already everywhere. 40 billion screens. He looked at the Vethkai delegate. Sovrath was now performing distress. His body language had shifted completely. In the last 30 seconds, his hands were raised in what the Veth Kai considered an expression of shock. He was making sounds. Dao watched him perform distress for a moment. Then he took out his communicator. He opened a direct encrypted line. He typed 11 words he had been told 3 years ago he would never have to type, and hit send. Then he closed the communicator, put it in his pocket, and stood quietly while the chamber collapsed into chaos. Around him, his face did nothing. Vethkai had a word Keth saw that translated roughly as diplomatic correction. It had no real match in any human language, which the Vethkai had always considered a gap in human development. The concept was this: when a voice in the galactic conversation became too loud, too fast, too disruptive to the existing order, the established powers had the right, even the duty, to silence it, not through war, which was messy and expensive and attracted too much attention, through precision. The Veth Kai had performed Kethsol 14 times in 3 centuries. The target species always responded the same way: grief, then anger, then a formal grievance filed through conclave channels, then years of lobbying for sanctions, then slow, painful acceptance that the galaxy was old and complex, and the powerful moved as they wished. It always ended the same way. The biotoxin in Sovrath's breath cloud had been developed over 8 years, built specifically for human biology. It was undetectable by any scanner in common use. It worked in under 4 minutes. It left nothing behind. It was, by Vethkai standards, elegant. Sovrath sent his preliminary report to the Vethkai capital that evening. He noted the operation was successful. He noted the human delegation appeared to be in shock. He recommended beginning the standard condolence message within 24 hours. He had a template, 7 paragraphs. They had used it before. He began filling in the name, a UMN. He thought the correct word for what he felt was efficient. Back on Earth it was 3:47 a.m. in Lagos. A woman named Kioma Osei, Amara's daughter, 19 years old, studying architecture at the university, woke up to her phone buzzing, then buzzing. Again, then not stopping. She read the first message, then the second, then she put the phone face down on her bed and sat in the dark for a while. Outside her window, the city was starting to make noise. She could hear it building the way a storm builds, first nothing, then something, then everything at once. People in the streets, not the noise of celebration. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure why. She thought maybe she would later. She thought maybe there was something between hearing news and feeling it, a gap that her body was sitting in, and it hadn't decided yet which way to fall. She turned her phone back over. Feeds were everywhere, the chamber, her mother on the ground, the amber light coming through the skyglass ceiling. Steady and completely unaware, she looked at her mother's face in the feed for a long time. Then she got up, got dressed, and went to her desk. She had a structural model she'd been building for her thesis, small pieces that had to fit together exactly right. She sat down and kept working on it. She didn't know what else to do with her hands. The conclave spent the next 14 hours in emergency session. It was exactly as useful as emergency sessions tend to be. There were speeches, there were formal expressions of grief from 119 species. There were calls for investigation, calls for calm, calls for restraint. There were procedural motions and counter-motions, and a 3-hour debate about the correct order in which to debate things. The Vethkai delegation expressed through Sovreth's replacement. Sovreth himself had been quietly recalled, a standard precaution. Deep sorrow at the tragic event, full cooperation with any investigation, and confidence that no evidence would connect the Empire to what was clearly a terrible and mysterious medical incident. Earth's delegation said nothing. This was noted by some as grief. It was noted by Verith as something else, though he could not yet name what. He spent the night reviewing everything humanity had ever submitted to the Conclave database, trade records, diplomatic files, historical documents humanity had chosen to share when they first made contact, military capability, assessments which had been considered modest and which were now being reconsidered. He read human history again, not as the record of a developing civilization reaching for the stars, as a profile. He read about the wars. Humans had a lot of those, more than most species at comparable development stages, but what he kept returning to was not the wars themselves. It was what happened after them, what humans did with loss, how they rebuilt, how they used grief. Grief was, in most species, a phase, a period of dysfunction, followed by slow adaptation. The biological purpose was clear enough. You lost something, you hurt, you adjusted, you moved on. In humans, the file suggested grief sometimes did something else. Sometimes it became fuel. Verith filed a preliminary report at 4 inches in the morning. It was 3 pages. The last line read, "The assassination of Secretary General Asit may have consequences that do not match the Vethkai Empire's historical models. For this type of action, further observation required." He marked it Priority 1. Then he went to his window and looked out at the conclave central spire and thought about the look on Dalfem's face in the chamber. Not grief, not even rage, something quieter than both, something that had already decided. 3 things happened in the 6 hours after the session that nobody connected at the time. First, the crew of Earth's diplomatic transport vessel docked at the conclave's port, received a new set of coordinates, and moved the ship to a different docking bay. Ships moved all the time, nothing unusual. Second, 17 human commercial vessels registered as in transit through the sector, each filed minor course corrections with Port Authority. Each correction was small, each one unremarkable on its own. Together they moved every human vessel in the sector, roughly 40,000 km, in the same direction. Third, a Vethkai intelligence officer named Reth, who monitored human communications as part of his routine assignment, noticed that encrypted human traffic had increased by 800% in the last 4 hours and then stopped. Completely, not slowed, stopped. Every channel all at once, exact same moment. Reth filed a report flagging this as potentially significant. His supervisor reviewed it. He noted that grief responses in communal species often included communication surges followed by collective silence. He filed it under behavioral. He went to lunch. Amara Asi's body was prepared for transport home according to Earth's request. The conclave's medical staff noted that the cause of death was a fast-acting compound consistent with environmental toxins, but could not be more specifically identified. This conclusion was recorded in the official report. It was the kind of conclusion reached when the people writing it are looking carefully at the evidence and carefully away from the answer. The Vethkai condolence message was finalized and transmitted to Earth's conclave. Address at 6 inches the evening, 7 paragraphs, precise and perfectly meaningless. It expressed sorrow, solidarity, and hope for the future of the galactic community. It was received. It was logged. It was never answered. Dalfem booked a seat on a civilian transport back to Earth. The next morning he packed one bag. Before he left his quarters, he sat at his desk for a moment and wrote a formal resignation letter and submitted it to the Secretary General's office, the office that would now need a new title, a new name, a new person. He stood up and picked up his bag. On the desk he had left a small framed photograph. It was from 3 years ago, when he had first arrived at the conclave. Amara Asi was standing next to him in the frame, and she was laughing at something outside the shot. He didn't remember what she had been laughing at. He wished he did. He left the photograph on the desk. He walked out without looking back. At the port waiting for his transport, he sat in a gray plastic chair and watched the feeds on the wall screen. The conclave was still in session, still talking. 119 species expressing grief in 119 different formal registers. He watched them talk for a while, then he took out his communicator and checked one specific encrypted inbox. 1 message received, read acknowledged, 11 words. He put the communicator away and leaned back in the gray plastic chair and closed his eyes. The galaxy kept talking. It did not yet know that no one was listening anymore. Varith of the Cathara was still awake when Dalfem's transport left the port. He watched the ship's running lights disappear into the departure lane from his window. He thought about the empty chair on the central platform, which had been draped in black cloth by conclave staff as a gesture of respect, and which would be replaced before the next session. He thought about Sovreth's face. In those first 2 seconds, he thought about the 11-word message his intelligence colleagues had intercepted and failed to decode and filed as encrypted personal communication. Low Priority, he thought about human history, about what grief sometimes became. He opened a new field report. He typed one line, watch everything, note everything, do not assume you understand what you are watching. He saved it. Then he sat in his chair by the window, in the dark, and waited to see what the silence would become. He didn't have to wait long. 40 billion screens had carried the ceremony live. Now they carried the aftermath, the speeches, the grief, the procedures, the careful political language of an ancient institution managing a crisis it believed it had seen before, but on a small blue-green planet in the third system of a minor arm of the galaxy, in 100 cities and 10,000 living rooms, and a university room in Lagos where a 19-year-old architecture student sat, building a structural model with careful hands. The screens were also watched, and humanity was very, very quiet, the kind of quiet that has already made up its mind. The silence started small. One communication channel going quiet was nothing. Two was a coincidence, but by the time the galactic conclave's communication logs showed that every single human channel, diplomatic, commercial, personal, emergency, had gone dark at exactly the same moment. It was too late to call it a coincidence. It was 9:14 a.m. Conclave Standard Time, 72 hours after Amara Asi had fallen on the central platform. Every human voice in the galaxy stopped at once, like a held breath, like a door closing very quietly, so as not to wake anyone up. Conclave's communication office sent 3 inquiry signals to Earth's official channels. Standard protocol: when a member civilization went silent, the signals were received. The automated logs confirmed receipt, but no one responded. They sent 3 more, nothing. The Vethkai diplomatic office, which had been monitoring human communications carefully since the incident, noted the silence in their daily report and attached a cultural analysis from their xenopsychology division. The analysis was 6 pages long. It explained in careful academic language that mass communication shutdown was a documented grief behavior in social species with high emotional interdependence. The humans, the report suggested, were mourning collectively. They would emerge from the silence within a week, probably disorganized and emotionally raw, which would make them easier to manage during the coming grievance process. The report was distributed to 12 Vethka intelligence offices. It was wrong about almost everything. Yusuf Crane had been asleep when his communicator went off. He was a man who slept 4 hours a night by choice and considered anything more to be time stolen from useful thinking. So the fact that the call woke him at 2:00 a.m. meant it arrived in one of those 4 hours. He answered it on the first buzz. The person on the other end was not anyone he expected. He recognized the voice immediately. He had heard it 3 times in his career, always when the world had tilted in some irreversible direction. The voice spoke for 40 seconds. Crane listened. When the voice finished, Crane said, "Noted." He ended the call. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a moment. He was 53 years old, built like a man who had spent 20 years doing physical work, and another 20 years doing work that was harder, with a face that gave away exactly nothing, and had been that way so long he had forgotten it was ever different. He stood up, got dressed, went to his desk, and opened a channel. Over the next 4 hours he made 22 calls. Each call was short. Most of them were under 2 minutes. He gave instructions the way a person gives instructions when they have already thought through every version of the conversation and know exactly which words to use. When he was done, he closed the channel. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black, no ceremony, and stood by his window, looking out at the pre-dawn dark, and thought about what he had just set in motion. He did not feel good about it. He did not feel bad about it. He felt the particular steadiness of a person who has been handed a task that is completely clear and is now focused entirely on doing it. He finished the coffee. He went back to work. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session at 8:00 a.m. The chamber was in the UN's headquarters in Nairobi, rebuilt there 40 years ago when the old New York building had become more symbol than function. The room was plain, long table, chairs, screens on every wall showing feeds from the conclave and from monitoring stations. Across the human sphere, 15 people sat at the table. Each one represented a permanent seat. Each one had read the same briefing documents. Each one had arrived already knowing what they were going to vote. There were no speeches. This unusual Security Council sessions were built for speeches, for position statements and careful language, and the kind of diplomatic precision that could mean 3 different things depending on who was listening. Today there were no speeches because no one needed convincing and no one was performing for anyone else. The chair asked if there was discussion. No one spoke. The chair called the vote. 15 hands, 15 ayes, unanimous. The quiet resolution passed at 8:23 a.m. It was 11 words long. It was never read into any public record. It was never declassified. It was transmitted on a single encrypted line to one recipient. Admiral Yusuf Crane read it. He had already received it 2 hours before the vote from the call at 2:00 a.m., but the formal transmission made it real in a different way. He read it twice. Noted, he said to the empty room. He began issuing orders. At the conclave, the silence was being discussed in 3 separate emergency subcommittees simultaneously. The Lashan Federation, a species that communicated almost entirely through layered harmonics and had been studying human vocal patterns for 30 years as a hobby, sent a formal inquiry to the Kathara Observer Corps asking if the silence was a human mourning ritual with specific duration, and if so, what the correct galactic response was. Verath of the Kathara replied that he did not currently have sufficient data to characterize the silence as ritual behavior. The Lashan representative found this answer unsatisfying and filed a secondary inquiry asking for a clarification timeline. Verath did not reply to the secondary inquiry. He was busy. He was looking at shipping records. Specifically, he was looking at the movement of human vessels across a zone of space approximately 9 light-years in diameter, centered roughly on the conclave's position. He had pulled the records because he was thorough and because the 3 anomalous movements he had noticed 2 days ago had been filed and not followed up on, and that bothered him the way loose threads bothered him. He pulled 4 days of records, then he pulled 14 days. He sat back in his chair and looked at what he had found for a long time, without moving. The human vessels Commercial ships, transport vessels, registered cargo haulers, a few science. Survey ships had all made small course adjustments over the past 14 days, each. One was individually unremarkable, small. Changes in heading, minor speed. Alterations, scheduling adjustments that could be explained by a dozen commercial reasons, but when he mapped them all together, every single human vessel in the 9 light-year zone had moved, not toward each other, not away from each other, into a different arrangement. Pattern he couldn't name because he didn't have the strategic vocabulary for it, but which felt in the way that something deeply wrong feels even before you can explain why. Deliberate, not like ships responding to grief, like pieces being placed on a board. He filed in urgent report. He marked it priority 1, which he had now done twice in 4 days, which was twice more than he had done in his previous 40 years of service. He attached his vessel movement analysis. He wrote at the bottom, "I do not know what this means. I know it is not what it appears to be." He sent it, then he went back to the records and kept looking. Earth's public feeds were not dark. This was something the Vethkai analysts got wrong in their original assessment. They had assumed the communication blackout meant humanity was in collective shutdown, overwhelmed, paralyzed, turned inward. The public feeds were running constantly. Every news network, every public channel, every open broadcast that any person on Earth or in any human colony could watch, they were all carrying the same thing: the ceremony, the chamber, the amber light. Amara Os, walking to the platform, her smile, her opening words, the moment she listed to the left, not once, on a loop, every channel on Earth, on the human colony at Kepler Station, on the research base at Ganymede, on the 14 colony ships still in transit between systems everywhere humans lived. The same footage played over and over. Humans watched it. They did not talk to each other across the communication channels that had gone dark. Those were closed and locked in ways that looked like grief from the outside. But the feeds ran. The footage played. Every time it looped back to the beginning, to Amara Osa walking across the Blackstone floor toward the platform. 100 million people watched her walk there again, her smile. Her first 2 words, the dash where the sentence ended, they watched that dash like it owed them something. Crane spent 36 hours in what his staff called the room, which was a command center on the carrier S. Johannesburg that had been sealed for active operations and which nobody entered or left without his permission. He did not sleep during those 36 hours. He did not appear to need to. His second in command, Commander Ria Nair, had worked with him for 6 years. She was 38, Tamil British, and had a reputation for being the calmest person in any crisis, which was a reputation she had earned by being in several crises with Crane and discovering that he was somehow calmer than she was, and it had recalibrated her sense of what calm looked like. She brought him food twice during those 36 hours. Both times he ate it without looking at it or commenting on it, which meant he was deep in something and she should not interrupt. On the second time she brought food, she set it down and was leaving when he spoke without turning around. "How long," he said, "before the conclave figures out what we're doing?" She considered. "Varath's getting close." He pulled the shipping records. "Good." She waited. "Good. He's supposed to see it eventually." He moved something on the display in front of him. Not yet, though, not until the pieces are in place. She looked at the display, which showed the galaxy in a scale she found slightly humbling, with human assets marked in blue. The blue pieces were still moving quietly, steadily, like a tide coming in. What happens, she said carefully, when the pieces are in place? Crane picked up the food she had brought and ate some of it. Then we stopped being quiet. He said she left the room. She found, once she was in the corridor, that she needed to stand still for a moment. She had been in battles. She had been in 2 full fleet engagements and a dozen smaller ones. She knew what the beginning of a fight felt like. This felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that didn't have a word yet. The Vethkai Empire sent a second condolence message on the 3rd day of the silence. This one was even more carefully worded than the first. It expressed specific sympathy for the specific loss of such a specific and admirable leader as Secretary General Osai, and it invited Earth's new diplomatic representatives to a private meeting at which the Vethkai would be pleased to discuss the framework for moving forward in partnership. It was received, it was logged, it was never answered. In the Vethkai capital, in the high chamber where the Emperor's senior advisors met, there was a brief conversation about the silence. Most advisors considered it a non-issue. Standard grief timeline. The grievance process would begin within 2 weeks. They had prepared for it. One advisor, an older woman named Sarithas, who had served in intelligence for 40 years and had seen things that made her cautious in ways her colleagues found excessive, raised the vessel movement data that Verath had originally flagged 4 days ago. She asked if anyone had followed up on it. No one had. She asked if someone could. They said they would. They did not. Sarithas went home that night and pulled the data herself. She spent 4 hours with it. When she was done, she sat in her study and felt something that her species did not have a precise word for, but which translated roughly as, "We have made a door and we do not know what is on the other side." She filed a request the next morning for a full intelligence review of human military positioning. The request was assigned to a junior analyst. The junior analyst began the review 3 days later. By that point, the pieces were in place. On the 72nd hour exactly, Earth broke its silence, not with a message, not with a demand, not with a declaration of any kind. The human communication channels opened, every one of them simultaneously. At 9:14 a.m., the same moment they had closed, one signal came through. Single broadband transmission to every conclave member, to every listening post in the sector, to every ship in the surrounding space. It was not a message, it was a sound. Specifically, it was the audio from the ceremony, from the conclave's own archive. Amara Osei's voice, clear and warm, speaking the last words she ever said in public. "My name is Amara Osei. I am from a planet called Earth, and I am here because my people refused." And then silence, the real silence from the original recording. The silence of a room that had not yet understood what it was watching. The transmission played once, then it ended. The channels closed again. 40 billion screens across the galaxy had carried it. Every species heard it. Every conclave intelligence office logged it and began analyzing it and reached different conclusions about what it meant. Vareth of the Cathara did not need to analyze it. He had been sitting at his desk when it came through, and he heard her voice in the silence after it, and he felt something travel through him. That was not, he realized, fear. It was recognition. He had heard sounds like that before, not the specific words, the shape of the sound. He had heard it in the vocalizations of certain predator species when they were done calculating and had begun. He immediately opened a new report and began typing. It was the longest report he had filed in his career. He was still writing it 2 hours later when the first human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Vethkai space, not an armada, 7 ships. 7 ships moving with the calm, particular precision of things that have been told exactly what to do and have no questions about it. The Vethkai border station held them immediately, asked their designation, asked their purpose, asked them to hold position and await clearance. The 7 ships did not slow down, they did not respond, they simply kept coming with a steadiness that the border station's commander would later describe in a report that was widely circulated and widely discussed as the most frightening thing she had ever seen, not because of what the ships did, but because of how they moved, like they had already seen the end of this and were simply going through the steps to get there. In Lagos, Kioma Ose heard the transmission on a public screen while crossing a street. She stopped walking. The people around her stopped too. The whole block went still for the 40 seconds it played. Her mother's voice, warm, clear, exactly the way it sounded in every memory she had. The silence at the end. She stood in the street until the transmission finished. Then she crossed to the other side, walked back to the university, climbed the stairs to her studio, sat down and looked at the structural model on her desk. She had been building it for 6 months. It was a bridge design, her own concept, something she had been working out slowly and carefully, piece by piece. It was almost finished. She looked at it, then she thought about what the transmission meant, what it meant that humanity had gone quiet for 3 days and then broadcast that sound and gone quiet again. She was 19 years old and she was not a soldier, and she did not know the details of the quiet resolution or the name of Admiral Crane or what 7 ships disappearing into Vethkai space at high speed implied, but she was her mother's daughter. She understood subtext. She understood what it meant when a person who had been quiet for a long time chose exactly those words to speak with. She looked at the structural model. She went back to work. The Vethkai border commander's name was Thal. She had held her post for 18 years. She had managed 12 different diplomatic incidents, 2 minor blockades, and 1 attempted smuggling operation involving creatures that technically didn't exist according to 4 different treaties. She was, by any reasonable measure, experienced. She was not prepared for this. The 7 human ships had not answered a single hail. They had not slowed. They had not veered. They had come through Vethka space at standard travel speed, not aggressive speed, not a charge, just steady, the way water moves through a pipe. Like stopping was not a concept that applied to them. Thal had called her superior had called his superior. The order came back, stop them. She scrambled her patrol fleet, 22 ships, standard Vethkai border enforcement configuration. They formed a blockade line ahead of the 7 human vessels. and opened a general broadcast on every frequency. This is a violation of Vethkai Imperial Space. You are ordered to come to full stop and prepare for boarding and inspection. Failure to comply will be considered an act of aggression. The 7 ships kept coming. She gave the warning 3 times. Protocol required 3 warnings. The 3 warnings took 4 minutes. The human ships crossed the blockade line. The first shot came from Thal's flagship, a warning shot, a disabling beam aimed at the lead human vessel's engine section, standard deterrent. Non-lethal if aimed correctly. She aimed it correctly. The beam hit the human ship. The human ship kept moving. Then everything happened at once, and 18 years of border experience were not enough for any of it. The engagement lasted 9 hours. This was the first thing that went into every subsequent report as an anomaly. A standard border engagement between a force of 22 ships and a force of 7 ships should have ended in 30 minutes at most. Either the smaller force surrendered or it was destroyed. That was how math worked. The math did not work this way. Verith received fragments of the sensor data in real time from a Cathara monitoring satellite that had been drifting in the sector for routine observation. He watched the fragments come in and started typing a new field report before the engagement was over, because he could already see what was happening, and he knew his organization needed to know it as fast as possible. The human ships did not fight to survive. This was the key observation. Verith wrote it, underlined it, and wrote it again. They did not fight to survive. They fought to accomplish. Every conventional military doctrine in every species Verith had ever studied was built around the same basic foundation: preserve your force, achieve your objective, retreat when the cost becomes too high. You protect your ships, because ships are hard to build and crews are hard to train, and there is always another engagement coming, so you do not spend more than you need to on this one. Human ships did not operate this way. When Thal's fleet tried to force the human formation apart by targeting the lead vessels, a standard tactic: cut off the head, scatter the body. The human formation did not scatter, it rotated. The damaged ships moved to the interior of the formation. The undamaged ships moved to the exterior, and the attack pattern didn't even pause. It simply continued from a different angle. When Thal tried targeting the human command vessel, identifiable by its communication array, the 3 ships closest to it did not retreat to form a protective screen. They accelerated toward the attacking Vethkai ships, directly toward them, without evasion. Thal's gunners, who were well trained, hesitated. The hesitation cost 4 seconds. The 4 seconds cost 2 ships. Verith wrote in his report, they used our expectation of self-preservation as a weapon. We flinched. They had calculated that we would flinch. By hour 6, Thal had lost 9 ships. The humans had lost 1. She called for reinforcements. A second Vethkai fleet, twice the size of her original force, arrived at hour 7. The humans fought them too. By hour 9, the combined Vethkai force had lost 60% of its ships and was no longer capable of holding a coherent formation. The human fleet, which had now lost a total of 3 ships out of 7, simply flew past the debris and continued into Vethkai space. Thal broadcast a formal surrender and request for ceasefire on every frequency. Human ships did not respond. They had Not responded to anything since they entered the sector. They just kept moving. Admiral Crane received the engagement report on the Johannesburg and read it at his desk without any expression at all. Commander Nera stood nearby, watching him read, which was something she sometimes did because Crane's face during a report told her things the report itself didn't. This time his face told her nothing. When he finished, he set the report down. Casualties, she asked. 3 ships. Full crew on 1, partial evacuations on the other 2. She said nothing for a moment. And the Vethkai, 14 ships. Destroyed, 19 heavily damaged. She was quiet again. This was not something you celebrated, even when it was necessary. The weight of it was the weight of it. The Second Fleet arrives at the home system perimeter in 6 hours, Crane said, and the lockdown teams already in position. He picked up the report again. The relay stations first, then the supply lines, then the jump gates. We do it in that order, and we do it quietly. They'll notice when the relays go dark. Yes, Crane said, that's fine. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. She had learned over 6 years that when Crane went quiet after saying something like, that's fine, it meant he had already thought through everything she was about to ask and had decided the answers were not in doubt. She went back to her station. The Second Fleet arrived at the Vethkai home system perimeter in 5 hours and 40 minutes. The relay stations went dark 11 minutes. Later, the Galactic Conclave received news of the engagement in fragments. The first fragment was a formal distress signal from Commander Thal's border station, which was heavily damaged and operating on emergency power. The signal was received by the Conclave's monitoring office and flagged as a border incident. The second fragment was a data packet from Verith's monitoring satellite, his complete engagement analysis, which he had transmitted the moment he finished writing it. It arrived at the Cathara intelligence headquarters and was classified. Immediately upon review, the director of intelligence read it, went pale in the particular way that Cathara go pale, and called 3 people. The third fragment was a public communication from the Vethkai Empire's foreign ministry, which stated that human forces had engaged in unprovoked aggression against a lawful border patrol and demanded immediate conclave intervention. The conclave convened an emergency session. It was the 4th emergency session in 5 days. At this session, for the first time, there was a representative from Earth. Not Daofam, who was back home, not any of the diplomatic staff who had been at the ceremony. A new face, a young woman named Priya Seth, who held the temporary title of observer and who had been briefed precisely on what to say and what not to say. She said very little when the Vethkai representative, a new one since Sovrath, was still recalled, delivered a passionate speech about unprovoked aggression and human militarism and the need for immediate sanctions. Priasad listened politely when the conclave chair asked if Earth's observer wished to respond. Priasad said, we are addressing a situation. We will communicate with the conclave when there is something to communicate. And the conclave chair asked what situation. She said she was not in a position to elaborate at this time. She apologized for any inconvenience. Then she sat down and did not speak again for the rest of the session. The Vethka representative demanded a response. He used the word aggression 11 times and the phrase unprovoked attack 7 times, and called for an immediate ceasefire and human withdrawal 3 times. Prayasad listened to all of it and said nothing in the observer gallery above. Varath watched her say nothing and thought, this is not a diplomat managing a crisis, this is a soldier holding a position, the thing that Varath's report described as most significant, more significant than the combat tactics, more significant than the loss ratios, was something that happened at the very end of the 9-hour engagement. Commander Thal had opened a direct audio channel to the human flagship. She had done this at hour 8 when her reinforcements had been cut down to a third of their number, and she could see the mathematics clearly. She wanted to talk, she wanted to negotiate, she wanted to understand who she was talking to. A voice answered. It was calm, not the forced calm of someone managing fear, the calm of someone sitting at a desk, doing work they had done many times before. Thal told it her name and rank, and asked who she was speaking with. The voice said Crane. She asked for a ceasefire. The voice said keep shooting or stop. There is no third option. She stopped. The voice ended the call. The human fleet flew past her disabled ships without boarding them, without scanning them, without any interest in them whatsoever. They were not obstacles anymore, and so they were not things to interact with. Thal sat in her damaged bridge for a long time after the human ships disappeared from her sensors. She wrote her incident report. It was 40 pages. Detailed, thorough, comprehensive. The last paragraph read, I have reviewed 14 years of border incident documentation. I have reviewed the records of every significant military engagement in this sector over the past century. I do not have a category for what I observed. Today, the human force did not fight like a force trying to win. They fought like a force that had already won and was performing the remaining steps as a formality. I do not know how to convey how different this is from everything I have been trained to understand about conflict. I'm including this note because I believe it is the most important thing in this report, and I am not sure how to say it more clearly than this. On Earth, the feeds showed very little. The conclave's emergency sessions were broadcast and humans watched them. The Vethkai representative speeches were translated and carried on every network. The diplomatic language of unprovoked aggression and international law and the framework of civilized galactic society was translated accurately. Humans watched it. They did not comment very much on any of it. This was several alien observers stationed on Earth noted in their own reports. Also unusual, humans had a well-documented tendency toward vocal public opinion on every subject. Social media networks on every human platform were some of the most active communication systems in the known galaxy. Humans argued about everything, constantly, loudly, at length. Those networks were not quiet, but they were not arguing. They were sharing the footage of the ceremony over and over. Amara Os walking across the black stone floor, her smile, her first words, the dash alongside it in 100 different human languages, one phrase, repeated so many times that 3 different xenolinguistics teams flagged it as potentially a formal declaration of some kind and asked their translation departments to clarify. The phrase was, we remember. It was not a declaration. It was not a slogan. It had not been organized or promoted by any government or institution. It had simply appeared spontaneously, the way things appear in a species that has been having the same feeling at the same time, and discovers in the middle of having it that there are words for it after all. We remember the translation departments confirmed it meant exactly what it appeared to mean. They filed their assessments, several concluded it was an expression of collective grief and would likely fade as the grieving process moved forward. Verth read those assessments and thought they were the second most wrong thing he had read this week. After the Vethkai Xenopsychology report about collective grief shut down, he was beginning to understand something about humanity that none of the files had quite captured. They did not use memory to hold on to the past. They used it to aim. In the Vethkai capital, the Emperor's court was in crisis. The relay stations in the outer systems had gone dark. Supply ships coming from 3 directions had stopped arriving, not attacked, simply unable to move through space where the jump routes had been locked by systems. No Vethkai codebreaker had been able to open the home system's long-range communication array, which connected the capital to 38 colonies, had gone silent. They were not under attack. There were no human ships in their home system. There were no explosions, no blockading fleets, no visible military presence of any kind. They were simply increasingly alone. Sarthais, the intelligence advisor who had tried to flag the vessel movements weeks ago, sat in the emergency council session and said nothing while her colleagues debated the situation in increasingly loud terms. She had tried, she had filed the request. She was past the point saying "I told you so" had any value. She was thinking about the phrase "we remember," which her translators had also flagged, and about the engagement at the border, and about the 11 words that Earth's communication office had transmitted on that one open channel 3 days ago before going silent. Again, nobody knew what the 11 words meant. They had been decoded. The encryption had been simple, almost deliberately so, but the message made no sense to anyone who read it. The 11 words were, "She was not finished. We are finishing it for her." Sarthais had read them 14 times. She thought she understood them. She did not say this out loud in the council chamber, because there was nothing useful to be done with understanding them now. She thought about Amara Ose, who she had watched on the feed from the ceremony, who she had thought at the time was a remarkable person and a potential problem and a very good speaker. She thought about what it meant that a civilization's first response to losing that person was not grief and not rage, but 11 words and a set of chess pieces, placed so quietly that nobody had noticed until the board was already arranged. She thought, "We corrected the wrong thing." She thought, "We did not correct a diplomat." She thought, "We showed them what we were, and now they are showing us what they are." She sat quietly in the emergency council and listened to her colleagues argue about how to reopen the communication relays, and she thought about the engagement report she had read, and the phrase "we remember," and a specific sentence from Verth's field report that had been shared across intelligence networks. The sentence was, "They do not fight like a species afraid to lose. They fight like a species that has decided losing is not one of the available options." She had read a lot of military analysis in her career. She had never read a sentence that frightened her quite that much. Verith filed his full engagement analysis, the long version, with all supporting data. At the end of that day, it was 94 pages. He sent it to every Cathara intelligence office, the Conclave Security Council, and every neutral species within observation post in the sector. The cover note was 4 sentences. It said, "What you are about to read will seem like an analysis of a military engagement. It is not. It is a profile of a species in a state I do not have a name for. I recommend that every conclave member read this before the next session and adjust their expectations accordingly." He thought about adding more. He didn't. Some things were better left for the reader to discover themselves. The report would land differently if people came to their own conclusions. He had learned that in his 90 years of field work, you could tell someone that a fire was hot, or you could let them feel the heat and watch their face change. He went to his window. Outside, the conclave central spire was lit up for evening session, clean and bright against the dark. He thought about Amara Osei, who had stood at a podium in the most beautiful room that had ever existed and had not finished her sentence. He thought about what humanity was doing now. He thought about what word to use for what he was feeling. He couldn't find one. He went back to work. The document arrived at every conclave member's communication terminal at exactly the same moment, 37 seconds after it arrived. Every conclave intelligence office on record had flagged it. 20 seconds after that, 3 separate emergency session requests had been filed in the observer gallery of the conclave's monitoring room. 4 analysts sat looking at their screens without speaking because the document was short, very short, 3 columns on a single page. And sometimes the short things are the most difficult to process. It was the first communication Earth had sent to the full conclave since the transmission of Amara Osei's voice 2 weeks ago. There was no greeting, no header, no diplomatic language of any kind. 3 columns, 3 headings: protected, observed, Protocol 11, under protected 38 species. Names: every civilization that had voted to admit humanity to the conclave, listed in alphabetical order by conclave standard designation. Under observed, 61 species names: every civilization that had abstained from the vote. Under Protocol 11, 4 entries: the Vetka Empire, the Durrali Compact, the Sethkin Reach, the Morbath Collective, the Vetkai's 3 closest allied states, who had provided political cover during the grievance suppression process. Nothing else. No explanation of what Protocol 11 meant, no timeline, no list of demands, no invitation to negotiate, just the 3 columns. Verith read it 3 times. Then he filed a report that was, for the first time in his career, only 1 line long. It read, "Wait, nobody knew what Protocol 11 meant for the first 9 days. This was, as Verith understood immediately, deliberate. The uncertainty was part of the action. Every intelligence office in the conclave spent those 9 days theorizing. The theories ranged from a formal declaration of war to an ultimatum with hidden terms to an elaborate political bluff designed to force the Vetkai into making a visible concession before any actual military action. The Vetkai Empire sent 3 official communications to Earth during those 9 days. The first expressed outrage and demanded clarification. The second expressed concern and requested dialogue. The third dropped almost all formal language and simply asked plainly what Protocol 11 meant. None of them were answered. On the 10th day, it became clear what Protocol 11 meant, not because Earth explained it, because it started happening. The first thing to go was the Vetkai Empire's weapon storage network, not bombed, not raided, not destroyed in any visible, dramatic way that would make for useful military footage. Collapsed 47 weapons depots across 9 Vetkai systems simply stopped functioning on the same day. Structural integrity of each facility failed from the inside, not explosives, but something more precise, some kind of interference with the materials that held the buildings together so that they sank into themselves slowly and quietly, like sugar dissolving. The weapons inside were not destroyed. They were buried. Vetkai engineering teams arrived at each site and determined that excavation would take years. The materials used in the interference process were not identifiable by any technology the Vetkai possessed. The same day the depots went down, Vetkai military communication networks began dropping offline in sections, one relay at a time, each one going dark without warning, without any detectable cause. Within a week, 30% of the Vetkai military's communication infrastructure was offline. Within 3 weeks, 60%. The Vetkai sent repair teams. The repair teams fixed the relays. The relays went dark again 6 hours. Later, they sent more teams. The relays went dark faster. Eventually, the teams stopped going. The war fleets were next. This took longer, and it was the part of Protocol 11 that required the most direct action. Human ships appeared in Vetkai space in small groups, never large formations, never the kind of fleet presence that looked like a battle waiting to happen. 3 ships here, 5 there, moving through Vetkai space at standard speed. Unhurried, whenever a Vetkai war vessel crossed paths with a human group, one of 2 things happened. If the Vetkai vessel was a military ship, the human group brought it to a stop, not by destroying it, by disabling its weapons and engines with a precision that the Vetkai called frightening, and that the 3 neutral species observers who witnessed it called something they did not have a good word for. The crew was left unharmed, supplied with food and basic equipment. Then a human engineering team spent approximately 4 hours converting the ship, removing weapon systems, scaling down engine capacity, installing a different kind of navigation system, until what remained was a functioning vessel that could carry people and cargo between places and do nothing else. Then the human ships left. The modified vessel sat there intact, operational, and completely unable to fight anything. If the Vetkai vessel was a civilian ship, the human group did not stop it at all. They let it pass. Sometimes the human ships changed course slightly to give the civilian vessel more room. This distinction, military ships converted, civilian ships untouched, was noted in every report filed from every observer in the region. It was not the behavior of a force trying to destroy. It was the behavior of a force performing a very specific and deliberate task with very clear criteria. Verith wrote in his field report, "They are not making war. They are conducting a procedure. The difference matters more than I can fully express in this document. Durrani Compact, which had been the most vocal of the three allied states in providing political support for the Vetkai Empire's position after the assassination, received their version of Protocol 11 6 weeks in. It was slightly different from the Vetkai's, calibrated to what the Durrani had specifically done. The Durrani had not planned or executed the assassination. They had voted to suppress Earth's original petition for an investigation. They had used their conclave seat to run interference. They had written 4 official documents, calling the incident a tragic accident. Their weapons were not touched. Instead, every Durrani financial institution that had trade relationships with the Vetkai found those relationships terminated, a way that was technically legal, according to 7 different conclave commerce treaties. But that rendered the relationships impossible to reconstruct for a minimum of 14 years. The Durrani economy, which depended heavily on Vetkai trade routes, contracted by 30% in 2 months. No human ship ever entered Durrani space. No human representative ever contacted Durrani leadership. The Durrani simply found that everything they had built with the Vetkai had stopped working and that the mechanisms for rebuilding it were unavailable, and that the conclave treaty frameworks that should have protected them had been examined by human legal teams who had found 17 specific provisions that read correctly allowed exactly what was happening. The Durrani ambassador to the conclave requested an emergency session and gave a speech about the violation of sovereign economic rights. Priya Sath, still holding her observer chair, listened politely. She did not respond. The Emperor of the Vetkai Empire sent a formal surrender communication to Admiral Crane on day 47. It was a long document. Detailed. It laid out carefully and completely the full terms of capitulation the Vetkai were prepared to accept. It included acknowledgement of wrongdoing, offers of reparation, proposals for war crimes tribunals, offers to hand over Saul Vreth and every other individual involved in planning the assassination, and a request for immediate ceasefire and negotiation. It was thorough. It was by every conventional standard of diplomatic surrender complete. Crane read the whole thing. He put it on his desk. He picked up his communicator and opened a direct channel to the Vetkai capital. The Emperor's senior advisor answered immediately. He had clearly been sitting next to the communication terminal waiting. Crane said, "I received your communication." The advisor said they were grateful and asked when negotiations could begin. Crane said, "You misunderstand the situation." The advisor asked what he meant. Crane said, "You sent a surrender. We are not at war with you. War's end. We are correcting you. The correction will take as long as it takes. You are the advisor." Was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what humanity wanted, what the specific terms were, what conditions would end the correction. Crane said, "When the correction is complete, it will be complete. You will be able to tell the difference." The advisor asked with careful phrasing if there was anything the Empire could do to accelerate the process. Crane said, "Stop building weapons. Stop suppressing species smaller than you. Stop performing Kethsol and calling it diplomacy." The advisor started to say something about the complexity of interstellar governance and long-standing imperial policy. Crane ended the call. The emperor sent the surrender communication again the next day, slightly modified. It was received, logged and not answered. He sent it again 3 days later. Crane's response was one word, noted. He sent it 6 more times over the following 2 weeks. Each time the response was the same, single word. On the 18th attempt, Crane's full response was, noted. Stop. The emperor stopped. In the conclave observer gallery, Verith had been watching all of this unfold and had been writing about it continuously. For 6 weeks, his reports had grown longer and then shorter again, which was not a direction they usually traveled. He had started with comprehensive analysis and slowly moved toward the kind of notes a person writes when they are trying to understand something that keeps outrunning their vocabulary. His latest report was 7 pages. 6 of those pages were data, vessel movements, economic impact assessments, the status of each protocol, 11 action and its effects. The 7th page was different. He had titled it Observations, then crossed out the title, then written it again. It said, there is something I have been trying to describe for 6 weeks that I have not yet found the right words for. I will try again here. Every civilization I have studied in 90 years of fieldwork uses force as a means of expression. We fight because we want something, and fighting is how we take it. Or we fight because we are afraid of something, and fighting is how we stop being afraid. Or we fight because we are angry, and fighting is how anger moves through body large enough to have warships. Humanity is doing something different. They are not trying to take anything. The Vethkai's territory, resources, and population are completely untouched. Beyond the specific corrections, they are not demonstrating power for its own sake. There are no speeches, no victory broadcasts, no flag planting. They are not punishing in the way that punishment usually looks, where the goal is suffering as a signal. They are building something. It is being built very carefully with very specific materials, and when it is finished, it will be exactly what they intended and nothing extra. I believe the word for this is architecture. I believe grief, when it is long enough and cold enough and controlled enough, stops being grief and becomes architecture. I believe Amara Osai would have hated this, and I believe they know that, and I believe they are doing it anyway, because there are situations where the person you're doing something for would hate it, and you do it anyway because the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing is not available. I'm not sure this is a useful observation for an intelligence report. I'm including it because I think it is true on Earth. Kioma Os had started following the feeds more closely. She was still at university. She was still working on her thesis. The structural model on her desk was nearly finished. Now 6 months of slow, careful work almost done. She had not stopped building it even during the worst weeks when the feeds were full of engagement reports and protocol, 11 analyses and diplomatic speeches from 17 different species. She had watched all of it with the particular attention of someone who is looking for one specific thing. She had not found it yet. What she had found watching the feeds was that the galaxy was scared. This was interesting. The conclave members who were protected were mostly quiet and watchful. The ones who were observed were extremely careful about what they said publicly. Several of them had quietly submitted new requests to review their abstention Votes asking if the record could be amended, which the conclave's procedural office was carefully not answering. The Vethkai were reduced and humbled, and the emperor's face on the public feed looked like a man who had reached for something without checking whether his hand would fit in the space and had found too late that it would not. All of this Kioma watched. She was watching for something else. She found it on a Thursday afternoon in a small news segment from a colony world called Kepler Station, one of humanity's earliest off-world settlements, mostly scientists and their families, 300,000 people living in pressurized habitats around a cold blue star. The segment was not about Protocol 11, it was about school, specifically a school on Kepler Station had renamed its central hall after Amara Osei. The renaming ceremony was small, no officials, no speeches. Just the school's teachers and children gathered in the hall, which now had a plaque on the wall with her name and, underneath it, the beginning of her last sentence, not the whole sentence, just the beginning of it. I am from a planet called Earth, and I am here because my people refused. And then the dash. Plaque had the dash. It had been deliberately included. The stonecutter, interviewed afterward, said the family of the teacher who designed the plaque had asked specifically that the dash be there because that was where she had been stopped and they were not going to smooth it over. Kioma watched the segment twice, then she went to her desk and looked at her structural model, which was finished. She had finished it without realizing sometime in the last few days. While she was watching feeds and thinking about other things, she looked at it for a long time. It was a bridge, her own design, something she had been developing for months, but looking at it now in the quiet of her room, she understood for the first time what she had actually been building. It didn't look like a bridge you crossed. It looked like something that held two things together so they couldn't be pulled apart. She thought about her mother. She thought about 11 words and 7 ships in Protocol 11, and the plaque with the dash in a school hall on a cold colony world. She thought, this is not over, not because there is still fighting, because we will not let it be over, because we remember, because that is what we are. She put the model carefully in a case. She went to bed. She did not cry. She still had not cried. She wasn't sure anymore if she was going to. She thought that maybe the grief had gone somewhere else, into her hands, into the work, into all of it. She thought her mother might have understood that. She closed her eyes and listened to the city outside her window. Somewhere out in the galaxy, the correction continued, steady, deliberate, patient, built to last. The chair was still there. Someone had tried to move it 3 days before the conclave reconvened. The facilities team had sent a junior staff member to the central platform to do the standard reset, clear the space, replace the speaker's arrangement, prepare the chamber for the new session. Standard procedure. The black cloth had been on the chair for 4 months. The chair needed to be removed, cleaned, reassigned. The junior staff member had touched the chair, then he had stopped. He wasn't sure why. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the back of the chair, and something about the moment made his hands stop working. He was a young Lashan, 22 years old, who had worked facilities at the conclave for 8 months and had been in the chamber hundreds of times and had never felt it watch him back before. He let go of the chair. He went to his supervisor and said that the chair by the speaking platform, the one With the black cloth he wasn't certain. It should be moved. His supervisor looked at him for a moment, then she went a look at the chair herself. She stood there for a while, then she sent a note to the session planning office, asking for clarification on the disposition of the chair in question. The session planning office sent the note to the conclave administration. The administration sent it to the Secretary General's coordinating office. 3 days of notes traveling through every appropriate channel. The answer that came back was short and had no clear author. It said, "Leave it so it stayed polished." Name newly engraved on the back, Amara Osai, Secretary General, Earth, in every language she had spoken, which was 6. The black cloth removed, the chair simply present, empty at the head of the table in the position it had been placed for a ceremony 4 months ago and had never been moved from since. Session began at 9:00 a.m. The chamber filled slowly, 214 species, the same as before, though several had new representatives since the previous full session. The sky glass above was different today, the stars' light coming through in a pale silver rather than amber, the kind of light that felt like early winter. The Vethkai delegation came in last. They were smaller than before, 4 representatives instead of 12. They wore no decorative robes, which in Vethkai culture was the equivalent of arriving with empty hands. Deliberate display of diminished standing. They found their seats and sat down. Without speaking to anyone, the 3 allied states, the Durali, the Sethkin, the Morveth, sat in their places, quieter than they had ever been at a conclave session. The Durali representative, who had given a 14-minute speech about economic sovereignty 6 months ago, looked at the floor. The human delegation entered, not Priya Seth this time. She was in the gallery in a non-speaking role. The delegation was led by a man nobody in the chamber had seen before. A tall man in a plain dark uniform with no decoration except a small insignia on the left shoulder, who moved the way people move when they are not performing anything. Yusuf Crane sat down 1 seat to the left of Amara Osai's chair. He did not look at the chair, not because it caused him difficulty, because he already knew it was there. Vereth in the observer gallery watched him sit down and felt the chamber chain around him, not dramatically. The temperature didn't shift, no one made a sound, but something in the room reorganized itself like furniture, quietly moving at night, subtle, undeniable and permanent. The session was called to order. The chair of the conclave, a Lashan elder named Sorval, who had held the position for 30 years, and who had seen many things that he had thought were the strangest things he would ever see, all of which now occupied lower positions on that list, addressed the room. He said that the conclave was meeting today for the first time in full session since what he carefully called the events of 4 months ago. He said that the purpose of today's session was to hear a communication from Earth's delegation and to discuss the path forward. He said he hoped the discussion would be orderly and that he appreciated everyone's attendance. He said all of this with the dignity that 30 years in his position had given him, and only Vereth, who had known Sorval for 20 of those years, could see in the set of his shoulders that he was not sure what was about to happen and was not at all certain that orderly was still an available option. He invited Earth's representative to address the chamber. Crane stood up. He was not a speaker. This was clear from the first Moment he did not move his hands, he did not use the vocal shaping techniques that made galactic addresses carry. He spoke in standard conclave trade language, which he spoke competently and without elegance, and he did not seem to care that this was less impressive than it could have been. He said, "My name is Yusuf Crane. I'm here on behalf of Earth. We have a document we'd like to table." He sat down and distributed the document. It was 11 pages long. The first 9 pages were consequences, not laws, not rights, frameworks, not the elaborate procedural architecture that the conclave had spent 4 centuries building, and which produced on average 3 new sub-frameworks per year that each required their own sub-frameworks to interpret consequences, specific, graduated, non-negotiable, written in language so plain that it required no legal team to interpret and no committee to explain. If a conclave member attempted to assassinate the representative of another member, these specific things will happen in this specific order, with no exceptions, enforced by Earth. If a conclave member suppressed another member's petition by illegal means, these specific things will happen. If a conclave member engaged in what the document termed dominant species predation, using size, power, or age to control smaller civilizations through force or threat, these specific things will happen. Each set of consequences was calibrated, proportional to the action, not designed to destroy but to correct, specific enough that they described not just what would happen but how it would happen and how long it would take and what the exit conditions were. The chamber read it in silence. Verath read it in the gallery and thought about the word he had used in his report, architecture. He had been right. This was what they had been building for 4 months. It was not a weapon. It was a structure, like a wall, built around something precious, not to trap it but to define the space where it was safe. The 10th page was a guarantee. 1 paragraph short. Earth committed to non-aggression toward any conclave member not subject to a consequence. Protocol. Earth committed to responding when asked to enforce consequence. Protocols. Earth committed to withdrawing from active enforcement the moment each correction was complete. Earth committed to minding its own affairs. The paragraph ended, "We are not here to run the galaxy. We are here to make sure no one else does either." Page 11 was blank completely. Not a header, not a line, just white space. Crane, when the murmuring in the chamber reached a level he decided warranted addressing, spoke again without standing up. He said, "That's for whatever you want to add. This is your conclave. We wrote the consequences. The rest is yours." The murmuring continued. Several representatives tried to speak simultaneously. The chair recognized them in order. Most of what was said fell into one of 3 categories: concern about human authority being too broad, concern about human authority not being broad enough, and a very long speech from the Durali representative about the importance of shared governance frameworks that nobody in the chamber appeared to be listening to. The Vethkai delegation said nothing. Crane sat in his chair and let all of it happen around him with the expression of a man who has found a comfortable position and intends to stay in it. When the speaking died down, Sorville called the vote. The charter is tabled. Approve or reject. 201 ayes, 0 nays, 13 abstentions. Crane looked at the 13 abstentions on the tally board. His Expression did not change. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and took out a small card and wrote something on it and gave it to his aide. The aide later said the card had 13 names on it in Crane's handwriting, and the word noted underneath them all. After the session, the chamber slowly emptied. Delegations filed out in their various ways. Some spoke to each other. Some avoided each other. The Vethkai 4 left quickly and quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. The Durali representative lingered and tried to speak to Prayasada, who was polite and brief and gave him nothing useful. Vareth came down from the gallery. He had been trying for 4 months to get an interview with Crane. He had filed the request 3 times. Through proper channels, he had been told politely each time that Admiral Crane's schedule was restricted. He had accepted this because it was true and because Vareth had not lived 90 years by failing to recognize when a door was not open. Today in the corridor outside the main chamber, the door was open. He saw Crane standing by a window, alone, looking out at the conclave's exterior grounds. His aide was 20 m away, giving him space. Vareth walked over and stood beside him. Crane looked at him. You're the Cathara observer, Vareth? Yes, read your reports. Vareth waited a moment. All of them, the useful ones. Crane looked back out the window. The one about architecture, that one. Vareth was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure that was useful. It was accurate, Crane said. Accurate is useful. They stood in silence for a while. Outside, the conclave's grounds were neat and orderly and full of species going about their business. Vareth had one question. He had been carrying it for 4 months. He had considered many ways to ask it and had decided eventually on the direct one because he was 90 years old and had very little patience left for indirect. He said, what do humans want now from the galaxy? After all of this, what do you do with yourselves? Crane was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone who already knows the answer and is deciding whether the person asking has earned it. He said, we go home, we remember. Vareth waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He thought about those 2 sentences. He thought about Amara Ose and the 11 words and the plaque in the school hall, and Protocol 11 and the blank page at the end of an 11-page document. He thought about a grief that had become architecture and an architecture that had become law and a law that was now built into the oldest governing body, the known galaxy. He thought, that is all of it, isn't it? That is the entire thing. In 4 words, we go home, we remember. He said, that's enough. Court. Crane looked at him for the first time since they started talking. Really looked for now, he said. He picked up his coat from the window ledge where he had set it while they talked. He walked back toward his aide. He didn't look back. Vareth stood at the window for a long time after Crane left. He looked out at the conclave's grounds, which were the same as they had always been. Same paths, same carefully maintained gardens representing 11 different species, ideas of beauty. Same central spire catching the pale silver light. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. He thought about writing a report on the conversation. He started it in his head a few times. He couldn't find the framing. Every time he tried to put it into field report language, objective, analytical, structured, the conversation slipped out of that shape. and became something else he gave up on. The report he wrote in his private journal instead. He had kept the journal for 60 years. It was full of things that didn't fit into reports he wrote. Today I asked Crane what humans want. Now, he said they want to go home and remember. I asked if that was enough. He said, for now, I have been thinking about the words for now ever since. I think they mean we are not finished. Not with grief, not with remembering, not with building things out of what we lost. We are just finished with this part for now. I think this is the most frightening and also the most dignified thing I have heard anyone say in 4 months of watching a civilization do something I have never seen a civilization do. I think I will be writing about humanity for the rest of my career. I think that will not be long enough to understand them fully. I think that might be the point. On Earth, on a Thursday evening in Lagos, Kioma Os watched the conclave session on her feeds. She watched the vote, 201 eyes. She watched the charter pass. She watched the blank page being discussed and argued over and finally accepted. She watched the empty chair at the head of the table and thought about how the most powerful thing in that room, the thing that every delegation kept not looking at, was a chair with nobody in it. Her mother would have had something to say about that. She would have made it funny, probably. Amara Os had a way of making the weight of things lighter without making the weight smaller. It was a specific skill, and Kioma had been trying to learn it her whole life and wasn't sure she had it yet. She sat at her desk. The structural model was in its case. Finished, her thesis was almost done. She had 3 weeks left on her degree, and then she would graduate and start figuring out what came next. She thought about her mother walking across the black stone floor. She thought about the amber light. She thought about the beginning of a sentence that had not been finished. She opened her notebook. She was not a speech writer. She was not a diplomat. She was an architecture student from Lagos who was 3 weeks from graduating and had hands that were good with small, careful pieces. She wrote in her notebook the words she had been circling for 4 months without finding. She wrote she knew we would. That's why she walked out there. Not because she was sure it would be safe, because she was sure that if it wasn't, we would be the ones to answer for it. She looked at what she had written. That was it. That was the thing. Her mother had not been naive, had not walked to the platform in the most beautiful room that had ever existed and smiled that smile because she believed nothing could touch her. She had walked there because she trusted what came after. She had walked there because she knew her people. Kioma closed the notebook. Outside, the city was loud and alive and going about its evening in all the ways cities do. Lights coming on, food cooking, voices carrying everything ordinary and present. She listened to it. She thought, we remember, we will keep remembering. We will put her name on the wall and leave the dash there and build the thing she was building toward and do it all in her name, and that will be enough. Not because it fixes anything, because fixing things was never the point. The point was the refusing. That was what she had been trying to say at the podium. I am here because my people refused to be smaller, refused to be quiet, refused to accept that the galaxy was something that happened to them, refused to let the sentence stay unfinished. Kioma got up and made dinner. Simple things. Her mother's recipe. She had made it so many times she didn't need to think. About the steps, her hands moved through. It the way hands move through something. Known she ate at her desk, she watched. The last of the feeds. She went to bed. In the most beautiful room that had ever existed, across the galaxy in the pale silver light, a chair sat empty at the head of a table where the oldest governing body in known space had just built a new floor on top of itself. Chair was polished, the name was clear. The dash was not there, it was a chair. Not a plaque, and dashes do not go on chairs, but it was understood by every delegation that had sat in that room, by every species that had watched the feed, by every intelligence office that would file reports about this day. For the next 100 years, the sentence was not finished. That was not a tragedy. That was the whole point. Humanity was still speaking, and the galaxy, for the first time in its long and ancient history, was listening.